Why do evil and suffering have to exist? Why are they necessary? The good, perfect God of the universe created everything. Why didn't he create it? To be like him, good and perfect. This doesn't make sense. I reject the notion that God is good and that God is perfect, or that God exists at all. Said somebody. Wasn't me, though. Welcome to the Vitality Principle with me, Christopher Nelson II. This is now episode number 4. We're through 3 episodes, and we're just slowly but surely making our way through what ended up being a summary of my current perspective on reality. After years worth of deep study, years worth of fundamental change and revitalization of my life perspective and my sense of purpose, my sense of morality, my sense of my personality, who I am. And so we're going to continue walking through that on today's episode. But as a reminder, for anyone who is new to this episode, maybe this is the first episode that you're watching of the Vitality Principle, we've already walked through the first few sections of a 32-page essay or article that I wrote for fun, not out of a requirement for something school-related. I'm not conventionally known as an author. I decided to do this completely for fun. That is what we're walking through. And as you can see, we're not done walking through it yet. So if you have not seen the first 3 episodes, where in episode 1, I talk about my story and read the intro to this article, I outline the progression from my early childhood into my most recent adult months of living that led me to write this article. Now we're walking through it. Go check out episode 1 for that and the basic intro to this article. Check out episode 2 to see us outline and define beings and wills from this article, and then see episode number 3 to learn more about the purpose of creation overall, as I've outlined it in this article. The article is titled The Narrative of Creation. You can go find it on SUBSTACK. My account name is Weapon of Righteousness, or you could just type The Narrative of Creation into the search bar. It might just pop up. That said, we're going to continue our walkthrough now with a very, very hot button issue. This is a question, like I said in the introduction of this article, that has been discussed for a long, long time, and still no one seems to have an answer for it, or at least the answers that have been presented don't seem to be sufficient for most people. I'm obviously one of those people, and so here's my take on this issue. Number 4, episode number 4, section number 4. Number 4 is a pretty good number, biblically speaking, too, by the way. Maybe that's a podcast for another time. But right now, we're going to dive into the necessity of suffering in the creation narrative. That said, I'm going to do the same thing I've done for the last 2 episodes, which is read pretty much verbatim what I wrote in the article. And then at the end, I'm going to walk through some of the takeaways I had while I was writing out this article. Obviously, I encourage comments. I encourage you to interact with me about this. This, like I've said before, I don't know if I said it on episode 3, but I definitely said it on episodes number 1 and 2. This is not a comprehensive perspective on reality. It is a sufficient foundation for any conscious pursuit of truth and deeper trust in the identity and purposes of the God of the universe, so that we can grow our understanding of our personality, our understanding of our purpose, our duty, our morality, so that we can better align with the heart of God and achieve an ideal lifestyle as well as a peaceful conscience. That said, let's dive right on into it. Suffering's necessity. The total, unique, and supreme identity of God is clear. So we recognize that all righteousness and idealicism are inherent to God himself. Righteousness refers to good intentions and actions performed, which produce harmonious economy. And idealicism refers to a picturesque, harmonious environment. In creation, an example of righteousness would be a young person helping an elderly person cross the road. And an example of idealicism would be a vibrant meadow scene. Obviously, both of these realities glorify God because they reveal his unique character. He alone makes creation righteous and idyllic producing perfect harmony. But how do wickedness and calamity glorify God? As addressed in previous sections, all unrighteousness and calamity are inherent to creation itself, not inherent to God himself. Unrighteousness refers to evil intentions and actions performed, which produce suffering economy, and calamity refers to a chaotic, insufferable environment. In creation, an example of unrighteousness would be one person assaulting another person, and an example of calamity would be a tempestuous storm. But while neither unrighteousness nor calamity is inherent to God himself, these realities glorify God because they reveal his unique nature. He alone is righteous and idyllic, existing in perfect harmony, and a reality that no creature or environment can stake claim over. This is principle number 8, titled, according to me, twofold glorification. God's satisfaction occurs through the revelation of both his supernaturally upright nature and right-making character. As an example of this reality, imagine yourself in the outside world. There are no clouds in the sky, the sun is brightly shining, a person is standing within your view, and a shadow is darkly cast behind them. In this circumstance, you know that the person, the sun, and the shadow exist in a shared universe. You know that the sun is the supreme source of brightness. You know that the person is an inferior source of dimness. And you know that the shadow is an inferior dark outcome. As such, you conclude that the person shares common characteristics with both the sun and the shadow. But the sun and the shadow do not share any common characteristics with each other. Furthermore, you conclude that the shadow is only present because the sun exists at an elevated position in a shared domain with dim sources of brightness, like the person positioned below it. Even more so, you conclude that when the sun changes its position and or when the person changes their position, the shadow changes its position. You also conclude that if there were more clouds in the sky, the sun's brightness would be less visible, the person's dimness would be less dim, and the shadow's darkness would be less visible. The same relationship applies to the relationship between God, nature, humans, and suffering within the created order. To tie the analogy together directly, the sun represents God, the clouds represent material bodily limitation and demonic blinding, the shadow represents suffering, and the person represents creation, creatures, and the environment. You know that the creation, God, and suffering exist in a shared domain. You know that God is the supreme source of righteousness and idyllicism. You know that the creation is an inferior source of unrighteousness and calamity, occasionally demonstrating some righteousness and idyllicism. And you know that suffering is the inferior result of unrighteousness and calamity. As such, you conclude that creation shares common characteristics with both God and suffering. But God and suffering do not share any common characteristics with each other. Furthermore, you conclude that suffering is only present because God exists at an elevated position in a shared domain with creation, which is positioned below him. Even more so, you conclude that when God changes his position and or when creation changes its position, suffering changes its position. You also conclude that if there were greater material hindrance and demonic blinding, God's righteousness and idyllicism would be less visible. Creation's righteousness and idyllicism would be more visible, though not any greater, and suffering would occur less. This is principle number 9. I've coined the crepuscular revelation principle. Try to say that one 7 times fast. The existence of suffering is the outcome caused by the existence of grounded, natural, immanent, ordinary, inferior creatures and environments with respect to an elevated, transcendent, immanent, unique, supreme deity existing simultaneously in a shared natural domain. So why is suffering necessary? Because it reveals the totality of God's unique and supreme nature and character through his control over and activity amidst creaturely righteousness and wickedness, as well as environmental idealicism and calamity. Ultimately, remember this: light is always supreme over darkness. But darkness always has a purpose to fulfill within the domain that it shares with various kinds of light and light filters. As a simple reminder, to conclude this section, look no further than the first 5 verses of Scripture. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, one day. Genesis 1:1-5. That wraps up the 4th section of the narrative of creation article. This might arguably be one of my favorite sections of the entire article, quite honestly. There's just so many thoughts that I had about this section while I was writing it, and then after the fact, right now actually, while I'm discussing it. I'll even start from the beginning, or from the end rather, and work backwards towards the beginning. I think it's very interesting that we see in the first 5 verses of Scripture that God creates light. He says, "Let there be light," and there was light. But after speaking light into existence, he didn't get rid of the darkness. And there are many Christians who don't oftentimes see the purpose of evil in fulfilling God's good purposes and plans. Obviously, Joseph understood this very, very clearly. It's Joseph, the biblical and historical figure. He obviously, if you don't know the story, maybe you don't know the story, I shouldn't assume, and you're watching this, Joseph is one of 12 sons. He's the second youngest son in his family, and based on the unique aspects of his father Jacob's struggle to get his wife, long story short, he had to work an awful long time to get her, and then after getting her, she ended up having difficulty getting pregnant. Joseph ended up being one of the sons that wife had. And so Jacob, his father, had a unique love for Joseph. His brothers did not like that. Joseph had dreams that involved his brothers all bowing down before Joseph. And that obviously is a good way to get your siblings on your side. And so, needless to say, his brothers did not like him at all. They schemed up a way to try to get rid of him. Many of the brothers advocated for killing him. One of them, maybe another one of them too, advocated for just shipping him off somewhere. And so they ended up selling him to this band of merchants that was passing by on their way to Egypt. They sold Joseph. Joseph heads down to Egypt with them. Joseph ends up working and finding favor with a particular decently highly ranking man in the Egyptian government. That man's wife ends up making up a story about Joseph. That gets Joseph thrown in prison, where again, even though he's in prison, Joseph finds favor with God. He ends up building a reputation in prison that is of good note. It's a good reputation. And he ends up actually interpreting dreams for some of the prisoners. That ends up leading to him getting an opportunity to tell the Pharaoh of Egypt what his dream meant, what a particularly strange dream that the Pharaoh had meant. And the fact that Joseph was able to do that gained him favor with the Egyptian Pharaoh, and the Egyptian Pharaoh actually put Joseph in charge of the land of Egypt because of what was going to happen in the land of Egypt in the next few years. Joseph prophesied that there would be a famine that would come upon the land of Egypt, and as the guy who knew that was going to come, Pharaoh entrusted him to lead the operations of Egypt in such a way that would preserve the Egyptians. And so, all that said, Joseph, of everyone understood that God has a purpose in circumstances where evil has occurred. When his brothers sold him into slavery because of jealousy, when the Egyptian government official's wife told a lie about him, even in the prison situation, because in the prison situation, Joseph was right about what he prophesied about the future of one of the two prisoners. But when the prisoner ended up getting freed, which was part of the fulfilled prophecy, the scripture says that that prisoner forgot about Joseph. And Joseph had actually asked him to remember him when that prophecy came true. Did not happen. It happened later, but not initially. And so throughout all this injustice that Joseph was experiencing, what we see later on is the original dream that Joseph had years ago when he was just a young boy, had this dream, told it to his brothers. It was a vision of them all as like bushels of hay or something, bowing down before his. I think his might have been a little bit bigger. Go check the story again for yourself. But ultimately, that ends up coming true because during the course of that famine, the brothers needed to come up to Egypt to get food. Okay, they lived far away in the middle of generally nowhere, right? There's no large city. They only had so many resources. So they had to go to the nearest, largest country to get some resources to keep their family alive. So they come up to Egypt. They don't recognize Joseph now. Joseph has been away from their family for decades. At this point, he's now a full-grown man who's the second most powerful person in all of Egypt. And his brothers come up. They ask for food. Joseph remembers them. The brothers don't remember him. Joseph remembers them. And Joseph, I can only imagine all the emotions going through Joseph's mind at that point in time. We actually see some of those emotions throughout the course of that narrative. Joseph ended up pretty much playing games with his brothers. He told them that they had to go back and bring the youngest son in order to get food. Then he accused them of stealing something that he intentionally instructed to be planted in his brother's bags. And then close to the end, maybe even close to the beginning, I don't remember, Joseph has this moment of like emotional breakdown. He had to leave the room because he was just crying. And so all the stuff going through Joseph's mind after decades of not seeing his brothers, they show up here. He knows that this is a fulfillment of the dream that he had decades ago that just gained the total ire of his siblings. And here it is coming true. But he also knows the path that he took to get there. And at one point in time, when he eventually reveals himself to his brothers who are in total shock, Joseph tells them, it's like, you guys didn't send me here. You guys didn't send me to Egypt. God sent me here. Whoa. You mean God sent you here? Yeah. You mean God was responsible for ordaining the circumstance that involved us being jealous of you to the point that we sold you to these merchants, to the point that those merchants sold you to this government official in Egypt whose wife then lied about you so that you got thrown in prison so that then you could predict this future circumstance in the life of these two prisoners, to the point where one of the prisoners who you rightly prophesied about ended up remembering you, such that you ended up making a prophecy about the Pharaoh, yada, yada, yada. You mean all of that was God's responsibility? Yeah, it was. The good and the bad. It's obviously amazing that I've gained a reputation that has given me the ability to be the second most powerful person in this land at this time when we need it most. But ultimately, God's the one who brought me here. That was his reflection. That was what he told his brothers. I obviously added a little bit of detail there just to expand the point. But he does actually say that. He says, it was not you who sent me here to his brothers. It was God who sent me here. Then later on, after their father dies, the brothers still didn't fully get it. And so they think that now that their father has died, Joseph might try to actually seek revenge on them now because it's like, oh, dad's not here anymore. Dad's said his goodbyes. He's given his last blessings, etc. He's going to try to seek revenge on us, especially since he's in a position of power. And the way that we mistreated him, this dude is going to totally seek revenge on us. And what does Joseph tell them at that point in time? He says, guys, what you still don't get it, do you? What you meant for evil, God meant for good. I'm not going to try to seek revenge. I'm not here for revenge. I understand that God has put me here in this position for your benefit. And decades ago, when you were jealous of me and you sold me off to the merchants, etc., that kicked off that long chain of events, God had you in mind. He had your safety and your security in mind for his sake and for your sake. And so, number one, that's just an incredible takeaway from Joseph. But how does that tie into this? It ties directly into this because it means that God is deeply involved and has a perfect purpose for every single thing that occurs, good and evil. And this gets kind of to the example that I gave that was central to this section about sort of the sun, the shadow, the subject, the domain that you're within, and then the clouds as a filter. By the way, I named this principle the crepuscular revelation principle because of the idea of crepuscular clouds. I don't know if you've ever heard that term before. I hadn't heard it before. I had to look it up. It's this circumstance where the clouds are shaped in such a way that they block out the sun for the most part, but there are holes of light at certain points in the clouds that just shine these rays of sunlight straight down within that general area that the hole is in. Those are crepuscular clouds. And thinking about how to name and think about this principle of how you reconcile a good God with an evil reality, that came to the top of my mind. It's like the clouds block your ability to experience the sunlight, but not for everyone. Certain people are in a position where they are not experiencing that light filter. They're in a position under the sun where they can see the sun. They know the sun exists. They know that they are completely inferior to the sun. But they enjoy the sun. They stand in the presence of the sun. They see the shadow that they cast, which in this case would be their unrighteousness. They see how dim they are compared to a totally bright light source, and they're just in awe, and they enjoy. They're comforted by that. They're comforted by the fact that they are insufficient, but that the light source above them, who is superior to them, is sufficient for them. And that's exactly what the Christian's relationship with God is. At one point in time, we did not like to see our sin exposed. We did not like to see all the different ways that we contributed harm and evil to this reality that then we look out at and say, hey, there's tons of evil there. We need to do something about that. It's just cool to see how God changes the hearts and the dispositions of people who were once in that position, who were so focused on all the evil and all the harm being done around them that they couldn't look in the mirror and see that in themselves, such that they realized that they need to be united to a much brighter light source. They needed to be comforted and encapsulated by a much brighter light source. And that's what God does for people. He saves people. He brings them into the light. This is a concept that the Apostle John notes in 1 John 1. God is light, and in him there's no darkness at all. We should walk in the light. But at the same time, Jesus also revealed to us that people naturally don't want to do that, which is why there is so much evil in this world to begin with. People don't want to acknowledge their selfish motivations and how oftentimes, naturally, those selfish motivations fulfill our own pleasurable objectives at the expense of others in some way, whether or not we see it. At a bare minimum, our selfish ambition produces the fulfillment of our own objectives without consideration for God's objectives. And so that fundamentally is wrong. It's not correct. In the most general sense possible, it's not a good way to experience peace in your life, because you and I both know how insufficient we are. You and I both know that we've contributed harm to this reality in some way or another. And the fact that our natural disposition is to shut that down and to not address that is an indication of why there is suffering in this reality. But it also demonstrates the fact that there is a perfect God. There is a God who is light and has no darkness within him. There is a God who is omnibenevolent. And the fact that we are not that is, funny enough, a good piece of evidence that he exists. Okay. So, think about the sun shadow example. It's the clearest way to demonstrate this to people. The fact that people look out at the world and see injustice being done is a piece of evidence that suggests that there is something that is superior to us that casts that shadow of suffering and evil that we observe. But we're so focused on the shadow. We're so focused on the suffering that we naturally produce as people that we never stop to think, hang on a second, that's the shadow, that's the darkness, that's the evil, that's the suffering. What does that reveal about our position? What does that reveal about our identity collectively? And it very clearly reveals that there is someone who is superior to us. There is someone who is a source of goodness, who, if he were more involved in certain ways in our reality, we would not see the darkness as much, or the darkness might just go away. Spoiler alert, that will happen at some point in time. And so it's the fact that all of that ties together that way that is funny enough, a really good piece of evidence that suggests that God exists. And that's just independent of the fact that you could go test that for yourself. You might have just listened to me, and you might have just thought to yourself, that doesn't make sense. I refuse to believe that God exists because suffering exists. Well, you've just heard my argument for it, right? You've thought it through. It corresponds to something that you and I experience every day. We stand outside, we see the shadow that we cast on the ground, right? And that the shadow doesn't share any characteristics with the sun, but they both exist. And so you could take this application if you were serious about this, and you could really just say to yourself, okay, that doesn't sound like something I want to believe. But at a minimum, the example that he's using checks out with practical reality. Maybe he's right about the way this works with my conscience, with my inner person. And maybe I'll look around and I'll see all this evil and suffering, and maybe that will be, at some point in time, a cause for me to stop and say, whoa, that's a shadow of something that is shining down on something else that casts that shadow. And so maybe I'll dig into a little bit more and see where that leads. Maybe I'll become a little bit more curious. Maybe I'll recognize that I'm more insufficient than I like to admit, and that oftentimes what I think I want isn't actually what I want. And so I'm actually just pursuing things that I think sound good, that I think make sense. So maybe this is an example that will produce some of that self-reflection. It definitely produced that in me. I don't even remember how I stumbled upon that example. I think I was reading Hebrews chapter 10, and I came across that because in Hebrews chapter 10, we see that the author of Hebrews writes that the law of God was a shadow of the good to come. Right. Elsewhere in Scripture, we see that the law was made for those who are lawless. And we also see that the purpose of the law was to bring knowledge of sin. And so with all that kind of tied together, you kind of see that, that the law really was brought about to reveal our shadow, such that we could eventually be in the light through Jesus Christ, who came and fulfilled the law on our behalf. Kind of getting ahead of us a little bit here. That will be on the next episode of this podcast. But overall, this was a really interesting section. I'd really highly encourage you to go back, listen to this episode, or go check out the article, this section of the article in particular, and just think about this concept a little bit more. It seems kind of counterintuitive at first, but then you realize, wait, this checks out with natural reality. Maybe it checks out with the supernatural reality as well. And so I hope that this particular episode was helpful for you. The last takeaway I have for you, I guess, going out is that God's identity is fully glorified through the reality of suffering. Again, this might have gotten missed earlier on, but the fact that righteousness validates God's right-making ability, his character, which is that he makes things that are not right and upright, and that suffering and evil reflects God's perfect nature in that he is the only one who is inherently upright and right. It's those two concepts that really ground our understanding of God's identity and the fact that in everything, good or bad, we can see that there is a God who is glorifying himself perfectly as he fulfills his various purposes in this reality. So I did want to note that as well. That said, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope I gave you, at a minimum, something to think about. We didn't even really dive into the aspect of clouds and how that kind of factors into the spiritual picture. That's, again, more of that material hindrance that we as people have that limits our ability to understand God's truth and act in accordance with God's moral standard. And at the same time, the demonic hindrance as well. All the things that block us from seeing the sun in its full glory and experiencing the comfort that comes from standing in the presence of the sun and walking in the presence of the light. And so that stuff we could have dove into a little bit more. That's probably an episode for another time as well. Thank you for listening to this episode. We are almost done walking through the narrative of creation. We only have 2 more sections left to walk through. And so thank you for listening to this one. I'll see you back here on the next episode with a walkthrough of the centrality of redemption. Till then, take care.